Hello and welcome back. Today for episode 20, I'm joined by David Gill from Fauna and Flora International, who's speaking with us about their Saiga Antelope conservation project operating throughout Central Asia. David tells us about the past rocky decades the Saiga has experienced during the times of the Soviet Union and how the species almost became extinct following the crash in the early 90s. He talks about the animal's incredible fecundity, unique ecology, and peculiar features, as well as the incredible comeback it's made in the past few years. If you like this episode and would like to follow more of this project, please follow the links in the description. And if you'd like to support us, you can make a donation at restoreaplanet.org or follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Enjoy the conversation. Hello and welcome back to this week's episode on the Restore Our Planet podcast. Today I'm joined by David Gill from Fauna and Flora International, who's going to be talking to us a little bit about Saiga. So David, to kick things off, you mind telling us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this work?
Yeah, happy to. I'm a zoologist by original training. I've like a lot of people in conservation, like various bits and bobs of experience at the start. In Paraguay, I had a few months studying amphibians in the forest there. But probably my first sort of meaningful conservation experience was in Central Africa in a country called Equatorial Guinea. Worked for the Zoological Society in London, looking at bushmeat trade and the drivers of that. And that was a really formative experience for me in seeing the role of people in conservation as well. Really changed my mindset from a sort of more of an idealist zoologist at that time. And then from then worked at FFI for the last 10 years. So FFI is Fauna and Flora International, the world's oldest international conservation NGO based in the UK. Operating across 40 countries, been doing a variety of projects on that time, a lot of plant and tree projects, but over the last 3 years, focused in Central Asia, and including the Saiga Antelope, which I believe we'll talk about today.
Nice little segue. So let's crack on. Tell us about the Saiga and what's going on there.
Right, well, Saiga, where do we begin?
Maybe just a little bit of sort of ecology, sort of its behaviour, before we start bringing in the horrible human influence and all those terrible things. Let's start a little bit with, what is the animal? What's its kind of life cycle? Where does it live? Its behaviour, that sort of thing.
Lovely. Okay. Well, yeah. So I imagine a lot of your listeners may or may not have heard of Saiga as a species, but it is an antelope. It is basically found across Central Asia. It used to have a much wider range, but there's 5 populations remaining. There's one in Mongolia, there's one in an area of Russia called Kalmykia, and then there's 3 in Kazakhstan, and one of those crosses the border down to Uzbekistan. And if you're trying to picture that in your mind, what that looks like, it's vast steppe landscape. So sort of the kind of just going between short grassland to desert landscape, vast areas, huge areas of land, plains, I suppose is another word that might be more familiar to some listeners. And if you want an analogy, you could think of them as a Central Asian wildebeest in a way. They move in large numbers, and they have vast migration routes as well. So they travel up and down these plains across international borders. For reasons we'll discuss later, that's becoming more difficult for them, in search of the best grass and things to eat. You can imagine the climate there is harsh. It gets down to sort of -30, -40 in the winters and 30, 40 plus in the summertime. It's a harsh environment, and that can make a big difference to survival and health of the species. So they need to follow to find the right places to get good forage and to drink, etc. I don't know, anything more in ecology?
Yeah, more sort of their biology, really. So tell us a little bit about their sort of very iconic nostrils and the purpose behind those.
Yeah, so to picture a Saiga, hopefully, maybe some of you are Googling this at the same time to have a look at what they look like. They're one of the most unusual species to look like. They've got this fantastic face, this sort of long, slightly shriveled, spongy snout. Star Wars creatures come to mind. The males of the species have 2 beautiful horns, which are highly traded, and we'll talk about that later too in terms of what that means for the species conservation. And they also breed pretty quickly. It's another interesting thing that we'll talk about later, this amazing capacity of the species to increase in number when it has to. The females have twins often, and the species can kind of grow in number quite quickly too.
All right. Okay. So take us back a little bit, perhaps, maybe it's the last century or however long. How has human, influence and impacts and population growth and, need for resources and expansion, that kind of thing, how has that affected the life cycle and the overall sort of ecology and of the
Yeah, it's
Saiga?
amazing, and it's interesting where you can start. You can start that story at various points in time, but I suppose if you were to go back more than 100 years, you're talking millions of Saiga. I don't know if anybody knows the exact number, but there was a vast herds, possibly several million, like imagine wildebeest herds basically across Central Asia. There was, I'm going to have to try and get my dates right here, but there was an initial large-scale decline earlier in the 20th century, where Saiga were really hit quite heavily by mass hunting. And later on, during the formation of the Soviet Union, there was a recovery, and there's actually very good hunting management systems in place during the Soviet Union era, and Saiga were managed quite well, and the numbers were in good shape. The next big decline happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the protection and management that was sort of keeping Saiga safe disappeared very, very quickly, almost effectively overnight. That protection was no longer in place. That happened at the same time as demand for the horns I was talking about earlier. So the males have these two beautiful horns, and they've long been used in traditional Chinese medicine. Demand for that skyrocketed at the same time. So over the late 90s to early 2000s, there was this huge crash in population. So estimated more than 90% of the species numbers disappeared in 10-year periods. So that is one of the fastest declines for any animal species worldwide. Like, it was really catastrophic. I think maybe I'll leave it there for now, because there's another chapter in that story. Since then, there have been some strong recoveries. There's been some other declines related to disease, etc. But there is an overall picture of the species doing quite well now, which we'll touch on. But it was one of the fastest declines in any species worldwide.
Well, I mean, would you mind telling us about that? What was that? Was that due to disease? Was it hunting? What was the drivers behind that?
So the earlier decline was principally hunting in the late 90s, early noughties. That was just uncontrolled hunting for the horn, and the species really suffered from that.
So that was for the, sorry to interrupt, that was for the horn, that was for the trade, was that?
Yes.
So, or that wasn't just for meat or some whatever markets or?
No, that's what's caused this skyrocketing of trade, basically. That's what made it unsustainable. Saiga is hunted for meat too, and in the Soviet times, as part of that quite well managed sustainable trade, meat and hides was part of the reason for that trade. But what happened after that, it was this huge demand for horn, and oftentimes meat still is occasionally consumed from Saiga, and it is of some value, but it tends to be incidental. It's not the main driver of why Saiga are approached. The main reason they're approached is for their horn, which reach huge values, and that's what drives it, basically.
And is it, again, I sort of don't want to sort of accuse the Chinese, but is that for traditional Chinese medicine, or is that for other local belief?
It's mostly, it comes from different places in Southeast Asia. So China, Singapore, to some extent, Japan, Malaysia. There are various Asian countries, there's a demand for that, and there is a belief that Saiga horn has some medicinal properties, but not within Kazakhstan, no.
Right.
Or the other countries.
Oh, so it's completely from outside the demand.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And what effects has this had on locals? Do they have any sort of, do they care? Is it their kind of sense of this? I mean, obviously there's an emotional attachment, but does it affect their way of life at all?
I think it probably varies. it's not, it's different. It's different. You talk about, if you have a podcast, you'll be talking about lots of different conservation topics. It's not the same as somebody losing their whole forest habitats and all the direct impacts on their livelihoods, etc. For local people who are living in the Saiga ranges, poaching tends to be organized by outside groups. So there's an instability and insecurity that comes with that you have illegal people operating illegally coming into your villages, etc., to hunt Saiga is not generally something you would want in your village. And then people's attitude to Saiga, they got all that stuff comes with it. People's attitudes to Saiga vary. I think some people are apathetic, some people are in favor, some people benefit economically when they're involved in poaching. It totally varies. Yeah.
So they've obviously come under a number of threats. You mentioned, of course, the hunting, but also I think you alluded to the fact that you said that they've been roaming the steppes of Asia from one end of the continent to another. So have they also been put under territorial pressure as well? Are there certain routes that they can no longer take, or certain ways that they can no longer migrate, and etc.?
There have been so there's ongoing development in Central Asia which affects Saiga migration and affects other species too, like we know everywhere around the world. So new roads, new railways, certain infrastructure developments as well. So there are ongoing threats. A couple of big examples include, so for example, one of the populations in Kazakhstan migrates down to Uzbekistan. There is a border fence being put in place there, which had stopped the route, and also a railway line a couple hundred miles north of that, which provided a further barrier. So that's really affected Saiga migration, and you can see it. So our partner in Kazakhstan, who we do all of our work with, is a local organization called ACBK, fitted satellite collars on those Saiga. So you can really see it very starkly. You can see the movement on a map of it going back and forth every year, and then one year suddenly it stops at that point. There are mitigation measures put in place to reduce that impact. So in the border fence, the government agreed to make holes in certain areas along the bare fence for the Saiga to be able to get through. The railway line also has ramps coming up to it to allow Saiga to pass, but that's largely been ineffective so far. So that remains to be a significant barrier for Saiga migration.
All right, okay. David, you might give me 1 second. I'm just going to pause recording just a moment. Yeah. Sorry for everyone listening. We just had a little bit of a what do you call it? A little bit some noise in the background going on. Anyway, so David, back to you. So tell us a little bit now about the project that you've been working on. What have FFI been up to?
Right. Well, okay. So it's what FFI and what a lot of other people have been up to, actually. So for Saiga, one of the amazing, I think, for many of the many conservation projects worldwide, Saiga is a lovely example of where a group of organizations have really banded together for a species and work really effectively, actually. Maybe to take a slight backtrack on just FFI, but back in 2005, a memorandum of understanding, so an agreement was set up between all the Saiga range states, so the governments of each country came together, supported by NGOs as well, working on Saiga conservation, and they developed an MOU basically stating their intentions to recover Saiga. So we're talking, this is at the point when Saiga were at a real low. And these governments since then have increasingly committed resources to protect Saiga, and every 5 years they have a meeting and develop a new action plan. Like, this is what we're going to do for the next 5 years together, and it's been really effective. There's an organization called the Saiga Conservation Alliance as well, which is an NGO based, headquartered in Oxford in the UK, which also helps to ensure good communication and cooperation between Saiga NGOs. FFI is one of the other major NGOs working directly on its conservation on the ground.
Brilliant. And just to give people a little bit of perspective, so in the early 90s, before they experienced a catastrophic decline, the numbers are up in sort of, no one knows exactly, but sort of numbers of millions. And I think in 2016, 2017, they went down to about 130,000. I think I've got that about right.
So there's a couple. Okay, there's Saiga story in terms of numbers. It's so hard to describe because there's so many different ups and
Right,
downs along
right.
the way. But you're right. Okay, so early 2000s, massive crash due to poaching. Saiga world comes together, develops really good conservation plans, and then you see it start to increase actually, and it's getting going up and up and up and up and up, and the measures are working. But then one day, and now I think this is 2015, there's a mass disease outbreak for Saiga, and they lose something like 80% of their population. Overnight is probably exaggerating a bit, but pretty much in a matter of days and weeks, there's a huge death. So it's this critical moment again for the Saiga conservation community where
And what was the disease?
it's I'm not going to
That's
try.
okay. No, sorry, don't worry. Sorry to put you on the spot. I know they experience a number of diseases, don't they? Especially when their numbers decrease to such a small level. Then you've got threats of a limited gene pool, which leaves them vulnerable to all kinds of things. Well, something that's obviously quite apparent through the conversation we're having is these animals have been quite difficult to track generally because it's such a vast area, so many vast numbers that often it's a little bit difficult to understand exactly what's going on. But my
Yeah.
understanding that the work you've been doing is really kind of bringing all these fantastic groups of people together, very knowledgeable, and essentially, so tell us a little bit about kind of the stages. So you're saying about you bringing in these organisations. What exactly was going on the ground? So now tell us about work with local communities in these areas and what they've been up to and their impacts.
Right. Okay. So Saiga conservation work on the ground. So it's principally led by the government in each of these countries. So there's the first thing that needed to be put in place was improved monitoring and protection of the species. Basically, the very sort of straightforward conservation work. The species was being hunted at a rate that wasn't sustainable, and that's vastly improved across all Saiga range state countries. You have to understand the challenge of protecting Saiga in that, as we've described before, they really do move around vast landscapes. So the monitoring and anti-poaching teams have an incredibly tough job to do so. So one monitoring team we work with, for example, with our partner in Kazakhstan, ATBK, they have a monitoring team that tracks Saiga. They're a team of 4 and they operate in 2 cars, and they track an area the size of Scotland every year, basically, to try and follow Saiga. So that's one team, right? Can you imagine yourself in that position, being in a car? Like, where do you start? How do we make sure that we have good data on Saiga? How do we know where they all are? How can we stay ahead of poaching? How do we understand how poaching works? It's a big challenge. So part of the work has been to do everything you can to support those teams in terms of them having good working conditions and having all the right equipment and uniforms, etc. In terms of having the technology to improve their work, so giving them access to satellite collars, increasingly drones recently have been super effective. So we're using drones now, so you can actually get a head start on where Saiga are in the landscape, so you know where to do your patrolling, etc., etc. And also using technologies such as SMART, which I imagine probably some of your other podcasts.
That's the acronym SMART, isn't it?
So SMART is it's a tool, basically. It's a tool which people use to improve patrols, ranger patrols. So you can imagine rangers going out every day across vast landscapes, and how do you know it's effective, basically? So SMART is basically you map out where your patrol teams are going across the landscape. You collect data on what they're seeing and what they're finding. So how often are they seeing Saiga, for example? How often are they seeing poaching incidences? How often are they seeing other wildlife? And you use the information over time to build a picture, which tells you we need to be spending more. We're patrolling in the wrong places. Actually, next month we need to go here, here, and here because our past data tells us a story that says that poaching is more likely to be here, basically. So using all those technologies together, it's just increasingly improving the effectiveness of patrolling over time.
All right, and there's some good news with this story. So tell us how the numbers have bounced back, and obviously there's multiple reasons why. I'd really like to focus on the fecundity.
Yeah.
And basically they breed like rabbits, as they say, or like sagas. People
Yeah,
may
like
now
Saiga.
say, yeah. Right.
Yeah, they tend to they have twins very often, which helps. So you just do the numbers. I guess there's a set of twins every year that, and the females tend to be also have quite high reproductive success, and so they bounce back quite quickly. So that's always been there's always been the card the species has had up its sleeve. So it has, as we've described before about various declines it's faced, it's really not looked good for Saiga. At least 2 or 3 times in its history, it was really going very fastly towards extinction. But if conservation measures can be put in place to give it a chance, it responds so quickly. And that's the amazing thing. So what are we seeing now? We're seeing the numbers, the latest number suggests in Kazakhstan alone, and that's where the best data is right now, there's over 840,000 Saiga. That's based on last year's aerial surveys. The team are actually, so our partner ACBK, in partnership with the government, is anytime now will be flying around Kazakhstan again to do the next round of aerial surveys. They'll be getting updated figures on how many there are, but that's a huge increase. We're sort of getting now to the sort of numbers that there were back in the good days, almost. So it's looking good.
So so what, 5 years more or less?
Yeah, it's amazing. So there's sort of the population over the last 5 years has been sort of growing by almost a sort of 30 to 40% every year, and that's sort of really pushing it up in the right direction. There's nuance in there. There's different Saiga populations, and different populations are increasing at different levels. So certainly none of them are safe. There's, as the flip side of how well Saiga conservation goes up, it can also go down very quickly. We know there's disease threats will happen again at some point, and the key is to build the strength of those populations so they can be resilient to that threat. Poaching also can increase at any point as well. The protection in place now for Saiga is quite good, but if it were to decrease again, then the Saiga would suffer, and also poaching is also becoming more sophisticated over time as well. So people poaching Saiga are increasingly using night vision goggles. They're using better vehicles. They use snowmobiles to travel in the winter when our ranger teams can't go out, etc. So there is an ongoing threat which needs to be managed, but despite that, the overall picture generally is that Saiga populations are doing well.
Fantastic. And what can you, I can't predict, but what would you like to see over the next 5 to 10 years?
What would we like to see? I think particularly, so of the 5 Saiga populations, 2 are doing pretty well, and 3, although recovering, are still incredibly small. There's sort of a few thousand each. So we'd love to see all 5 Saiga populations looking big and healthy. I think you'd like to see the connectivity of their habitat both maintained but also restored in key places. I mean, one of the reasons a lot of us, I think, can resonate with Saiga conservation is not just a kind of weird, lovely animal, which we love, but it's also this idea of them migrating. I think that's quite powerful. It's like this idea that there are still wild landscapes out there, which there really are in Central Asia, and that there's an old species like a Saiga doing its thing of migrating hundreds of miles backwards and forwards. I think that's a powerful idea. So we certainly like that still happens, but it is at risk in certain places, and on the between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, it's not really been functioning over the last few years. So to see that happen again would be a beautiful thing. I think also there's more work to be done in terms of bringing local people into Saiga conservation. There's a huge amount has been done. There's been some wonderful work on community engagement and environmental education. There's been some innovative development projects that we've also been involved in southern Kazakhstan too. But there's much more to be done. I think a large emphasis in Saiga conservation has been on its management and protection because it was in such a bad way, and because poaching was so obviously the principal threat. But to save the species, a lot of the investment has gone into ensuring that its protection was in place. But now that that's looking better, and as long as that continues to be maintained and enhanced, I think also at the same time, I think more can be done to strengthen links with local communities in Saiga conservation areas and make them feel really part of the same success as well.
Fantastic. All right, David. Well, where can people follow your work and find out more about the project?
So many places. So we're part in Kazakhstan for Saiga. We're part of a big partnership actually called the Altyn Dala Conservation Initiative. And I'd love people to look up Altyn Dala and find them on Twitter and social media, because that's where our work, but also all of our work of our other partners in Kazakhstan is promoted. And also I would look up the Saiga Conservation Alliance as well, if you want to see an organization which is representing and pushing Saiga conservation forward across all the countries where it's found. I've largely been talking about our work in Kazakhstan today, and that's where most of the world's Saiga are found, but loved great work in Russia and Mongolia and Uzbekistan too, which needs to be celebrated as well.
Fantastic. David, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jack. Nice to talk to you.